A husband kicks out his pregnant wife and son because she refuses to live with his overbearing parents. Post in the comments where are you watching this video from, and don't forget to subscribe. Naomi adjusted the strap of her black cocktail dress, her reflection in the mirror showing a confident woman ready for the night ahead. Her best friend, Leah, had dragged her to this party, insisting she needed a break from the grind of work and endless goals. Naomi, a young paralegal with dreams of law school, rarely made time for herself. Tonight, however, was different. She had promised Leah she intended to follow through. The room buzzed with the hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, and laughter. It was a networking event, technically, but the casual atmosphere felt more like a gathering of friends. Naomi stood at the edge of the room, nursing a glass of wine and surveying the crowd when her gaze met his. Richard. He was tall, with sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the ends and a sharp jawline that seemed almost sculpted. His suit was tailored perfectly, exuding an air of ease and privilege. But what struck Naomi most were his eyes. A piercing blue that seemed to hold both charm and curiosity. Before she could look away, he smiled, and in a few strides he was standing in front of her. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, his voice smooth yet unassuming. Naomi arched an eyebrow. "Trying to, but these events always feel like work." Richard chuckled. "You're not wrong. I've already handed out my business card more times than I can count. I'm Richard, by the way." "Naomi," she replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm but warm, a balance that immediately set her at ease. Their conversation flowed effortlessly. Richard shared snippets of his life, how he worked in marketing but harbored a love for photography. Naomi, in turn, spoke about her aspirations to become a lawyer and the long hours she put into her paralegal job. They joked about the absurdity of small talk at events like these and bonded over their shared love of travel and books. As the evening wore on, Naomi found herself laughing more than she had in weeks. Richard was attentive, asking questions that showed genuine interest. When she mentioned her late nights at the firm, he didn't respond with a dismissive, "Wow, you're busy," but instead said, "That kind of drive is impressive. You must be amazing at what you do." By the end of the night, when Richard asked for her number, Naomi hesitated for only a second before handing him her phone. There was something about him, a spark that made her think, maybe this is worth a chance. The next few weeks passed in a blur of text messages, late-night phone calls, and weekend dates. Richard swept her off her feet with his effortless charm and thoughtful gestures. He surprised her with her favorite coffee when she worked late and took her to hidden gems around the city, small cafes, art galleries, and parks she had never known existed. With him, life felt lighter, as if the weight she carried was finally being shared. Naomi's friends noticed the change in her. "You're glowing," Leah teased one evening over dinner. "Who's the guy?" When Naomi told her about Richard, Leah's expression shifted slightly. "He sounds great, but you sure about dating someone from that kind of background? Sometimes those families—" "Leah, don't start," Naomi interrupted, rolling her eyes. "He's not like that, and his family isn't even an issue. He loves me for me." Leah raised her hands in surrender. All right. Just be careful, okay?" Months passed and their relationship deepened. Richard introduced Naomi to his world, one of polished events, upscale restaurants, and weekends in his family's vacation home. Naomi, though initially intimidated, found herself adapting. She learned the subtle codes of conversation his friends used and how to navigate spaces that seemed designed to exclude her. Through it all, Richard stood by her side, proud to show her off. Then came the inevitable moment: meeting his parents. Richard's family lived in a sprawling estate outside the city. The driveway alone was longer than the street Naomi had grown up on. As they approached the grand front door, Naomi clutched Richard's hand tighter. "Relax," he said with a reassuring smile. "They'll love you." But from the moment the door opened, Naomi felt the weight of their scrutiny. His mother, Mary, was impeccably dressed, her pearl necklace catching the light as she offered Naomi a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be Naomi," she said. "Richard's told us so much about you." His father, George, was more reserved. He shook her hand briefly, his eyes flicking over her as though assessing her worth. Over dinner, the subtle jabs began. "So, Naomi," Mary started, dabbing her lips with a napkin, "Richard mentioned you're a paralegal. That must be quite demanding." "It is," Naomi replied evenly, sensing the undertone. "But I enjoy the work. It's a stepping stone to law school." "Oh, how ambitious," Mary said, a faint edge to her tone. "I imagine it must be hard to balance everything." George added, "And you're originally from—" Naomi hesitated. "Brooklyn. My mother raised me there." "Brooklyn," Mary echoed, her voice laden with unspoken judgment. "How quaint." Richard squeezed Naomi's hand under the table, his silent apology for their behavior. After dinner, as they left the estate, he wrapped his arm around her. "I'm sorry about my parents. They're just old-fashioned." Naomi forced a smile. "It's okay. I can handle it." But as they drove back to the city, a nagging doubt crept into her mind. Could she truly fit into Richard's world? Despite the rocky introduction, Richard proposed 6 months later. It was an intimate moment, just the two of them in the park where they had shared their first date. Naomi's doubts melted away as he knelt before her, his eyes filled with love. "Yes," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I'll marry you." In that moment, she believed they could overcome anything: his parents' judgment, the cultural differences, and the challenges of their vastly different worlds. Love, she thought, was enough. For now. Married life started with a flurry of excitement and optimism. Naomi and Richard moved into a cozy townhouse in the city, with its small garden and warm, sunlit rooms. Naomi spent weekends decorating, determined to make their home a place filled with love and comfort. She hung pictures of their honeymoon in Paris on the walls, arranged flowers in the living room, and added little touches that reflected their shared life. It felt like the beginning of something beautiful. For a while, things were just that, beautiful. Richard seemed attentive and affectionate, and Naomi basked in the joy of their new life together. But cracks began to form when his parents, Mary and George, made their first visit to the townhouse. Mary arrived with a designer handbag over her arm and a critical eye that scanned every inch of the home. "It's quaint," she said, her tone less than complimentary, "but it could use a little refinement. Perhaps I could recommend an interior designer." Naomi, who had poured her heart into making the house their sanctuary, forced a smile. "I appreciate the offer, but we're happy with it as it is." Mary's lips tightened, but she said nothing. George, meanwhile, commented on the small size of the dining table, adding, "I suppose it's all you can manage in a space like this." Naomi clenched her fists under the table, but Richard simply chuckled and said, "Well, it works for us." That first visit set the tone for every interaction with his parents. Their criticism was never overt, but always present, a low hum of disapproval that lingered long after they left. They questioned Naomi's cooking, her work schedule, even her ability to manage a household. As time went on, Richard began to change. At first, Naomi didn't notice. He was still the charming man she fell in love with, still brought her flowers occasionally and kissed her goodbye in the mornings. But when his parents visited, he seemed to withdraw. Instead of defending her against their subtle barbs, he sat quietly, or worse, laughed along. One evening, after Mary had spent an entire dinner questioning Naomi's choice of a career over starting a family, Naomi confronted Richard. "Why don't you ever stand up for me?" she asked, her voice a mix of frustration and hurt. Richard sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Naomi, it's not worth it. They're just set in their ways. You know they don't mean anything by it. They don't mean anything by calling me unfit to raise children or saying our home isn't good enough." Her voice rose despite her best efforts. "Do you know how hard I work to make this place feel like a home? For us?" Richard shook his head. "You're reading too much into it. They're my parents. They're just trying to help in their own way." Naomi felt her stomach twist. It wasn't just that he didn't defend her. It was that he didn't see the problem at all. The turning point came when Naomi announced she was pregnant with their first child. She had imagined this moment for months, picturing Richard's face lighting up with joy, his arms wrapping around her in celebration. Instead, his reaction was muted. "Wow," he said, staring at her. "That's big news." "Big news?" Naomi repeated, struggling to hide her disappointment. "I thought you'd be happy." "I am," Richard said quickly. "It's just unexpected. Are we ready for this? With your job and everything?" Naomi felt a pang of frustration. "We'll make it work, we always do." But Richard's uncertainty lingered, and when his parents found out, they only made things worse. Mary and George visited a week later, bringing a bottle of wine. "For Richard, of course," Mary said with a tight smile. When Naomi shared the news, Mary's response was tepid at best. "Well, I suppose congratulations are in order," she said, her tone implying anything but joy. "Though I do hope you'll reconsider your work situation. A child needs a mother who's present." Naomi swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "I'm perfectly capable of balancing my career and being a mother." George, as usual, chimed in with his unwanted opinion. "Raising children is a full-time job, Naomi. You wouldn't want to deprive the baby of a proper upbringing, would you?" Naomi's fist clenched under the table, her nails digging into her palms. She looked to Richard, hoping he would say something, anything, to back her up, but he avoided her gaze, staring at his plate instead. Months passed, and the tension in the house grew. Naomi worked tirelessly to prepare for the baby's arrival while juggling her demanding job and keeping up with household responsibilities. Richard's contributions dwindled. He spent more time at work or out with friends, leaving Naomi to manage everything on her own. Mary and George visited more frequently, offering advice that felt more like judgment. They criticized the nursery Naomi had painstakingly decorated, questioned her dietary choices, and even suggested that Richard take charge of the baby's upbringing since Naomi was too busy with her career. Richard's support became increasingly unreliable. He started echoing his parents' sentiments, subtly undermining Naomi's efforts. "Maybe they're right," he said one evening after another heated visit from his parents. "You've been so stressed lately. Maybe you should take some time off work." Naomi stared at him, incredulous. "I'm stressed because I'm doing everything by myself. If you want to help, how about picking up some of the slack?" "I work hard, too," Richard shot back. "You're not the only one under pressure." "Hard? You mean staying late at the office and spending weekends with your friends while I do everything here?" Richard threw up his hands. "You're impossible to talk to when you're like this." The argument ended with Richard storming out of the house, leaving Naomi alone in the nursery she had built with love and hope for their growing family. When their son, Logan, was born, Naomi thought things might finally change. For a time they did. Richard seemed genuinely excited about being a father, taking photos with Logan and showing him off to his friends. But the novelty wore off quickly. He left most of the childcare to Naomi, claiming he was too busy with work. Mary and George's involvement increased. They visited weekly, always with unsolicited advice and veiled criticisms. They questioned how Naomi held the baby, the brand of diapers she used, even the temperature of the nursery. Naomi tried to stay strong, but the weight of their judgment, combined with Richard's growing indifference, began to take its toll. She felt isolated in her own home, surrounded by people who treated her as an outsider. And Richard, the man who had once promised her a life of love and partnership, now seemed more like a stranger, someone who had chosen his parents' approval over their marriage. The love that had once felt unshakable now seemed fragile, as if it could crumble under the slightest pressure. And Naomi, holding her son close, wondered how long she could endure it. Naomi sat in the living room, her laptop balanced precariously on her knees as she edited a legal brief for her boss. The sound of Logan's laughter echoed from the nursery where he played with blocks, his small hands trying to stack them as high as possible. Naomi's life revolved around moments like this, balancing work, motherhood, and maintaining the fragile semblance of a marriage that felt increasingly one-sided. Richard walked in from the kitchen holding a beer. He glanced at her screen, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Still working, huh?" "Yes," Naomi replied without looking up. "This needs to be submitted by tomorrow morning." Richard sat on the couch across from her, flipping on the television. The sound of a sports game filled the room, drowning out the soft hum of Logan's giggles. Naomi's fingers froze over her keyboard. "Could you turn that down?" she asked. "I'm trying to concentrate." Richard barely glanced at her. "It's not that loud." Naomi sighed, closing her laptop. There was no point arguing. This was how things were now. Her efforts to communicate dismissed, her needs minimized. She missed the man who used to care about her opinions, who once made her feel valued. Over the next few weeks, Naomi began noticing subtle but significant changes in Richard. He started coming home later, his excuses vague and inconsistent. Work ran late, he would say, though his office hours hadn't changed. On weekends, he spent more time with his friends, leaving Naomi to care for Logan alone. The financial burden also shifted entirely onto Naomi's shoulders. Richard claimed his job was in a rough patch and stopped contributing to their expenses. Every bill, every grocery run, and every repair for their home fell to her. One evening, Naomi confronted him. "Richard, I can't keep doing this alone. You're not contributing financially, and I'm exhausted." Richard, lounging on the couch with his phone in hand, barely looked up. "I told you, my job isn't paying much right now." "That's not an excuse to stop trying," Naomi said, her voice tinged with frustration. "Do you know how much pressure I'm under? Between work, Logan, and keeping this house running, I feel like I'm drowning." Richard rolled his eyes. "You're always complaining. Maybe you should learn to relax." Naomi's hands trembled with anger, but she forced herself to stay calm. "This isn't just about me, Richard. This is about us, about Logan." He finally looked at her, his expression hard. "If you're so unhappy, maybe you should take a break. Quit your job, stay home with Logan, and stop stressing yourself out." Naomi stared at him, stunned. "Quit my job? How would we pay the bills or the rent? I don't know, Richard said with a shrug. Figure it out. The strain in their relationship began to seep into their parenting. Logan, now a curious toddler, often repeated things he overheard from Richard or his parents. Naomi would hear him say things like, "Mommy, why can't you cook like Grandma?" or "Daddy says you're always busy." One afternoon, while Naomi was cleaning the kitchen, Logan walked in with a pout. "Daddy says you don't play with me enough." Naomi knelt down to his level, her heart aching. "Logan, Mommy loves you so much, and I work hard so we can have everything we need. Do you understand that?" Logan nodded slowly, but Naomi could see the confusion in his eyes. He was too young to grasp the complexities of their situation, but she could feel the seeds of division being sown. The final straw came during a dinner with Mary and George. They had invited themselves over, as they often did, bringing with them their usual air of superiority. Mary critiqued every dish Naomi had prepared, while George regaled them with stories of Richard's promising youth. "You know," Mary said, cutting into her steak, "it's a shame you're still working those long hours, Naomi. A child Logan's age needs his mother at home." Naomi forced a smile. "I do my best to balance everything." "Well," George added, "if Richard weren't so tied up at work, I'm sure he could take on more responsibility. But of course, he has a real career to focus on." Naomi's fork clattered onto her plate. She turned to Richard, who was staring down at his food, silent as always. "Are you going to say something?" Richard looked up, his face blank. "What do you want me to say? They're not wrong." The room fell silent. Naomi felt her chest tighten, anger and humiliation bubbling to the surface. She stood abruptly, taking her plate to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Mary sigh. "Well, that was dramatic." Later that night, as Naomi tucked Logan into bed, she thought about the woman she had been when she first met Richard. Confident, ambitious, full of hope. Now, she felt like a shadow of that person, constantly fighting to prove her worth to a man who no longer seemed to see it. Richard's words echoed in her mind. "They're not wrong." Her trust in him, once unwavering, was crumbling. And for the first time, Naomi began to wonder if their marriage was worth saving. The next morning, as Richard prepared to leave for work, Naomi stopped him at the door. "We need to talk." Richard sighed, adjusting his tie. "About what?" "About us. About this marriage. I can't keep pretending everything is fine." Richard's expression hardened. "I don't have time for this right now, Naomi. Can we do this later?" "No," she said firmly. "We're doing this now." He stared at her, clearly annoyed, but said nothing. Naomi took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I need to know if you're still committed to this family, to me, because it doesn't feel like it." Richard scoffed. "You're overreacting. Just because things aren't perfect doesn't mean I'm not committed." "Actions speak louder than words, Richard," Naomi shot back. "And right now your actions are telling me that you don't care." He opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of Logan crying from the nursery interrupted him. Richard glanced toward the stairs, then back at Naomi. "We'll talk later," he said, brushing past her. As the door closed behind him, Naomi stood there, her heart heavy with the realization that later might never come. The morning Naomi discovered she was pregnant with their second child, she sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the test in her hands. 2 faint lines. She felt a swirl of emotions, excitement for the new life growing inside her, dread at what it would mean for her already strained marriage, and fear for the challenges that lay ahead. She had dreamed of having another baby, a sibling for Logan, but not like this, not while her marriage was hanging by a thread. When Richard came home that evening, Naomi decided to tell him immediately. She waited until Logan was asleep, setting 2 cups of tea on the coffee table as Richard scrolled through his phone on the couch. "I have some news," Naomi began, sitting beside him. Her voice trembled slightly, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. Richard looked up, his expression unreadable. "What's up?" "I'm pregnant," she said, her words hanging in the air like a fragile thread. For a moment, Richard said nothing. His face didn't light up with joy or excitement as she had hoped. Instead, his brow furrowed and his lips pressed into a thin line. "Pregnant?" he repeated, his tone flat. "Yes," Naomi said, feeling the first twinge of disappointment. "We're going to have another baby." Richard leaned back against the couch, running a hand through his hair. "Wow, that's big news." Naomi's stomach dropped. "Big news? That's all you have to say?" "I mean, it's just unexpected," he said, avoiding her gaze. "Are we even ready for this? Logan's a handful as it is, and with your work—" "Richard, we'll figure it out," Naomi interrupted, trying to keep her voice calm. "We always do." But his lack of enthusiasm was a knife to her heart. She had hoped this news would bring them closer, that it might reignite some of the love and partnership that had faded over the years. Instead, it felt like another wedge driving them further apart. When Richard's parents found out, their reaction was even colder. Mary called to congratulate them, though her tone carried little warmth. "Another baby?" she said, her voice clipped. "Well, I hope this means Naomi will finally consider staying home. A child needs their mother, after all." Naomi gripped the phone tighter, forcing a smile into her voice. "I'm perfectly capable of balancing my career and motherhood." Mary sniffed. "We'll see." George was no better. When they visited a week later, he launched into a monologue about the importance of a stable home environment. Raising 1 child is a challenge, but 2? That's a full-time job. Richard, you'll have to step up to keep things running smoothly. Naomi clenched her fists under the dining table, her nails digging into her palms. It was as if she didn't exist in their eyes, as if she wasn't already carrying the weight of their household on her shoulders. After they left, Naomi turned to Richard. "Why don't you ever stand up for me? They treat me like I'm invisible, like I'm not even a part of this family." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "Naomi, they're just trying to help." "That's not help, Richard. That's judgment, and you let them get away with it every time." He threw up his hands. "What do you want me to do? Start a fight with my parents? They're not going to change, and I'm not going to waste my energy trying." Naomi stared at him, her chest tight with frustration. "You're supposed to be my partner. I need you to have my back." "Maybe if you didn't take everything so personally, it wouldn't be an issue," Richard shot back. His words hit her like a slap. Without another word, she turned and went upstairs, leaving him alone in the living room. As her pregnancy progressed, the tension in the house only grew. Naomi juggled her demanding job, caring for Logan, and managing the household, all while dealing with the physical and emotional toll of carrying a baby. Richard, meanwhile, seemed to withdraw further. He spent more time at work or with his friends, coming home late and leaving early. When he was home, he was either distracted or irritable. One evening, Naomi came home from work to find the kitchen a mess and Logan still in his pajamas. Richard was on the couch, watching television with a beer in hand. "Richard," Naomi said, setting her bag down. "What's going on? Why isn't Logan ready for bed? Richard shrugged. He's fine. We were just hanging out. Hanging out? You couldn't even get him dressed? Naomi, I've been working all day. Give me a break. So have I, she snapped. But I still managed to take care of things around here. Richard rolled his eyes. Here we go again. Always with the martyr act. Naomi felt her blood boil. This isn't a martyr act, Richard. This is reality. I'm doing everything while you sit here and act like it's not your problem. He stood, his face darkening. Maybe, if you weren't so obsessed with your job, you'd have more time for your family. The words were like a punch to the gut. Naomi's voice trembled as she replied, Don't you dare put this on me. I'm working to keep this family afloat because you refuse to step up. Maybe we wouldn't have to struggle so much if we moved in with my parents, Richard said, his tone sharp. They've already offered to help. Naomi froze. Move in with your parents? Are you serious? Why not? It would take the pressure off. They've got the space, and it's not like you'd have to do everything alone. She shook her head, incredulous. You really think that's the solution? Moving in with two people who treat me like I'm less than human? Who criticize everything I do? They're not that bad, Richard argued. You're just being stubborn. Naomi stared at him, her chest heaving with anger. I am not moving into that house. End of discussion. Richard glared at her, his jaw tight. Fine. But don't come crying to me when things get harder. That night, Naomi lay awake, her hand resting on her growing belly. She thought about Logan, asleep in the next room, and the baby she carried inside her. She had sacrificed so much for this family, her time, her energy, her peace of mind. And yet, it was never enough. Richard and his parents didn't see her as a partner or an equal. They saw her as a burden, a problem to be managed. For the first time, Naomi began to wonder if this was a life she could continue to endure. The day Richard told Naomi to leave was both shocking and predictable, like a storm brewing for years that finally unleashed its fury. Naomi stood in the doorway of their bedroom, clutching the laundry basket against her growing belly, as Richard packed a duffel bag with clothes. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. "I'm going to stay with my parents for a while," Richard said, his tone detached. "Maybe you should think about doing the same." Naomi's hands tightened around the basket. "I already told you, I'm not moving in with them." Richard threw a shirt into the bag, his movement sharp and angry. "You're being impossible, Naomi. They're willing to help us, but you're too proud to accept it." "I'm not too proud, Richard," she said, her voice rising. "I'm protecting myself. Do you know how they treat me, or do you just not care?" "Of course I care," he snapped, zipping the bag with an angry jerk. "But you make everything harder. You complain about money, about Logan, about the house. Nothing's ever good enough for you." Naomi felt the words like a slap. "Good enough? I'm working 2 jobs, raising our son, and carrying your second child. And you think I'm the problem?" Richard slung the bag over his shoulder, his eyes cold. "Maybe you should leave, Naomi. Take Logan and figure things out on your own if you're so unhappy." The air seemed to leave the room. Naomi stared at him, searching his face for any sign of regret or doubt. There was none. "You're serious," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Dead serious," Richard replied. "This isn't working anymore. You're not happy, and frankly, neither am I." Naomi didn't cry. She didn't scream. She walked out of the room, set the laundry basket on the kitchen counter, and called Leah. Her best friend answered on the second ring. "Naomi, are you okay?" Naomi hesitated, the words caught in her throat. Finally, she said, "I need help. He's kicking me out." Leah's voice hardened. "I'm on my way. Don't do anything until I get there." Naomi hung up and went to Logan's room. Her son was sitting on the floor surrounded by blocks, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Hi, Mommy. Look what I made." Naomi knelt beside him, forcing a smile as she admired his tower. "It's amazing, sweetheart. You're so creative." "Are we going somewhere?" Logan asked, noticing the tension in her voice. She brushed his curls from his forehead. "Maybe, baby. But don't worry, Mommy's got everything under control." Leah arrived an hour later, her car parked haphazardly in the driveway. She stormed into the house, her eyes blazing with anger. Richard was sitting in the living room, scrolling through his phone. "You have some nerve," Leah said, her voice cutting through the silence. Richard looked up, startled. "Excuse me? Kicking your pregnant wife out of the house? What kind of man does that?" "This isn't your business," Richard snapped, standing up. "Naomi and I have problems, and we're dealing with them." "Dealing with them? By throwing her out while she's carrying your child? You're a coward, Richard." Naomi stepped between them, placing a hand on Leah's arm. "It's okay," she said softly. "Let's just get my things and go." Leah glared at Richard one last time before helping Naomi pack. They worked quickly, gathering clothes, toys for Logan, and a few essentials for the baby. Naomi moved through the house methodically, her mind numb as she tried to process the reality of her situation. By the time they were finished, the car was packed to the brim. Naomi stood in the driveway holding Logan's hand as she looked back at the house. It was the home she had built with so much hope and love, now reduced to a place of heartbreak and loss. Richard stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Take care," he said, as if she were a stranger leaving after a casual visit. Naomi didn't respond. She got into the car, buckled Logan into his seat, and closed the door. Leah started the engine, and they drove away. They spent the first night in a cheap motel. Logan, sensing the tension, stayed close to Naomi, his small hand gripping hers tightly. After he fell asleep, Naomi sat on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. "How did it come to this?" she whispered. Leah sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You deserve better than this, Naomi. You always have." Naomi nodded, though her heart felt heavy with doubt. I thought he loved me. I thought we could make it work." "Love doesn't look like this," Leah said firmly. "He doesn't deserve you, and he sure as hell doesn't deserve Logan or that baby." Naomi looked down at her growing belly, her resolve hardening. Leah was right. Richard had made his choice, and now she had to make hers. The next morning, Naomi called a local women's shelter. They offered her temporary housing and resources to help her get back on her feet. It wasn't ideal, but it was a start. She refused to let Richard's abandonment define her or dictate the future of her children. As they settled into the shelter, Naomi began to see a glimmer of hope. The other women there shared their stories of resilience, strength, and survival. They encouraged Naomi, reminding her that she was not alone in her struggle. She started researching her legal options, determined to fight for what was hers. If Richard thought he could simply discard her, he was wrong. She would make sure he faced the consequences of his actions. For the first time in years, Naomi felt a spark of the woman she used to be, the woman who was strong, ambitious, and unafraid to stand up for herself. She wasn't just fighting for her own future now. She was fighting for Logan and the baby she carried. They deserved a life free from Richard's neglect and his parents' toxic influence. As she tucked Logan into bed that night, He looked up at her with sleepy eyes. "Are we going to be okay, Mommy?" Naomi kissed his forehead, her voice steady and confident. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be more than okay." The shelter was small, its walls painted in soothing shades of blue and beige, but it was far from home. Naomi and Logan shared a single room with a twin bed and a fold-out cot, their belongings neatly stored in 2 suitcases by the door. It was a stark contrast to the spacious townhouse they had left behind, but Naomi reminded herself it was temporary. This was a stepping stone, not the end. Each morning began the same. Naomi woke early to prepare breakfast for Logan in the communal kitchen. She'd sit with him at one of the long tables, surrounded by other women and children who were also starting over. Some were older, with weathered faces and quiet determination. Others were young, like Naomi, their eyes still wide with shock and uncertainty. "Good morning," said Mrs. Ortiz, a shelter volunteer who had taken a particular liking to Logan. She placed a plate of fresh fruit in front of him and ruffled his hair. "How's my little artist today?" Logan grinned, holding up a drawing he'd made the night before. It was a crude depiction of a house with a red roof and a garden full of flowers. Naomi felt a pang in her chest. He was trying to recreate their old home, the one she had worked so hard to make warm and inviting. "It's beautiful, baby," she said, her voice soft. "You're so talented." Logan beamed, but Naomi could see the sadness in his eyes. He missed the life they had, even if he didn't fully understand why it had changed. Naomi spent her days juggling job applications, legal consultations, and doctor's appointments. The shelter provided her with access to resources she hadn't even known existed: counseling, financial planning workshops, and legal aid. She met with a lawyer named Clara, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a firm handshake, who helped her begin the process of filing for divorce and securing custody of Logan. "Do you have proof of your financial contributions to the household?" Clara asked during their first meeting. "Yes," Naomi replied, pulling a folder from her bag. "I've kept every receipt and payment confirmation. The lease is in my name, too." Clara nodded approvingly. "That's good. It'll strengthen your case. And as for custody, given his behavior and lack of involvement, I don't see him putting up much of a fight." Naomi wasn't so sure. Richard had always been unpredictable, and she couldn't shake the fear that he would try to use Logan against her. "Don't worry," Clara said, as if reading her mind. "We'll make sure you and your son are protected." The evenings were the hardest. After Logan fell asleep, Naomi would sit alone in the dimly lit room, her thoughts racing. She replayed every argument, every cold glance, every dismissive comment Richard had ever made. She thought about his parents, their constant criticism, and the way they had chipped away at her confidence over the years. How did I let it get this far, she wondered, but the answer was simple. She had stayed because she believed in their love. She had stayed because she thought she could fix it. She had stayed because she didn't want Logan to grow up in a broken home. Now she realized the home had been broken long before she left. One evening, as Naomi was preparing Logan for bed, he asked a question that made her heart ache. "Mommy, why doesn't Daddy love us anymore?" Naomi froze, her hands tightening around the corner of the blanket she was tucking under him. "Baby, it's not that Daddy doesn't love us," she said carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups don't know how to show their love the right way." Logan frowned. "But he told us to leave. If he loved us, wouldn't he want us to stay?" Naomi sat on the edge of the bed, pulling him into her arms. "Sometimes people make mistakes, Logan. Big mistakes. But you know what? You and your baby brother or sister will always have me, and I will love you more than anything in the world." Logan snuggled against her, his small arms wrapping around her waist. "I love you too, Mommy." Despite the challenges, Naomi began to find small victories in her new reality. She secured a part-time job as a legal assistant at a local firm where her boss, a kind older man named Mr. Patel, was understanding of her situation. "You're strong, Naomi," he said one afternoon after noticing her hesitance to accept the job. "This isn't charity. It's a partnership. We need someone sharp like you, and I think you need a fresh start." Naomi accepted the position with gratitude and threw herself into the work, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of drafting documents and organizing case files. The paycheck wasn't much, but it was a step toward independence. One day, while Naomi was at work, Leah called with news that sent a jolt of anger through her. "Richard's parents are trying to take over the lease on your townhouse," Leah said. "I heard it from a mutual friend. They're claiming you abandoned it." Naomi clenched her jaw. "I didn't abandon it. I was forced out, and the lease is in my name." "Exactly," Leah said, "which means you can fight this." Naomi's resolve hardened. She had worked too hard to let Mary and George take what was hers. She scheduled an emergency meeting with Clara and provided her with all the documentation she needed to contest the claim. "We've got a solid case," Clara said. "Don't worry, we'll make sure they don't get away with this." The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and emotional turmoil. Naomi attended court hearings, provided testimony, and faced Richard and his parents in the courtroom. They painted her as unstable and irresponsible, but Naomi stood her ground, presenting evidence of her financial contributions and her dedication to Logan's well-being. In the end, the judge ruled in her favor. The lease remained in her name, and she was granted primary custody of Logan. The relief was overwhelming, but it was bittersweet. She had won, but the battle had taken its toll. As Naomi walked out of the courthouse with Logan's hand in hers, she felt a surge of determination. This was just the beginning. There was still so much to rebuild, but she knew she could do it. For Logan, for the baby growing inside her, and for herself. That night, as she tucked Logan into bed, he looked up at her with a sleepy smile. "Mommy, are we going to be happy now?" Naomi kissed his forehead, her voice steady and full of conviction. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be happy. I promise." The day Naomi officially regained access to her townhouse was bright and crisp, with the kind of golden sunlight that seemed to symbolize new beginnings. She stood on the front steps with Logan at her side, her hand resting on her growing belly. The keys felt heavy in her palm, not just from their physical weight, but from what they represented: freedom, stability, and a chance to rebuild. "Mommy, are we really moving back home?" Logan asked, his voice tinged with both excitement and uncertainty. "Yes, baby," Naomi said, her heart swelling as she unlocked the door. "This is our home, and no one is going to take it from us again." They stepped inside, the familiar scent of the wooden floors and faint traces of lavender from an old diffuser greeting them. The space was empty, stripped of furniture and decorations, but it felt like a blank canvas waiting for a fresh start. Over the next few days, Naomi began the process of transforming the house back into a home. She used what little savings she had to buy essentials: a bed for Logan, a couch for the living room, and a small dining table where they could share meals. Leah showed up with a few boxes of kitchen supplies and linens, her no-nonsense attitude softening as she saw Naomi's determination. "This place already feels better without his energy here," Leah said, unpacking a box of plates. "You're doing great, Naomi." Naomi smiled, grateful for her friend's support. "It's not perfect, but it's ours." While setting up the house, Naomi continued to work at the law firm, her confidence growing with each passing day. Mr. Patel praised her efficiency and attention to detail, offering her more responsibilities as she proved her capabilities. "You've got a sharp mind," he said one afternoon. "I wouldn't be surprised if you end up running this place one day." Naomi laughed, but his words stayed with her. She began to see herself not as a woman defined by her struggles, but as someone capable of achieving the dreams she had once set aside. Richard, however, did not fade quietly into the background. A week after Naomi and Logan moved back into the townhouse, he called her out of the blue. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. Naomi hesitated, her stomach tightening. "What is it, Richard?" I need to see Logan," he said. "Can we meet up?" Naomi considered his request. Despite everything he had done, she didn't want to deny Logan a relationship with his father, but she also couldn't ignore the damage Richard had caused. "Fine," she said after a pause. "We can meet at the park, tomorrow at noon." The following day, Naomi sat on a bench at the park, watching as Logan ran around the playground. Richard arrived late, his clothes slightly rumpled and his expression weary. He greeted Logan with a hug, but his energy felt off, hesitant, as if he didn't know how to reconnect with his son. After Logan ran back to the swings, Richard turned to Naomi. "You've done a good job with him," he said, his voice low. "He seems happy." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Of course he's happy. I've worked hard to make sure of that." Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know I messed up, Naomi. I wasn't there when you needed me. I let my parents' opinions get in the way, and I pushed you away." Naomi's jaw tightened. "It's a little late for apologies, Richard. You didn't just push me away. You abandoned me. You left me pregnant and alone." "I know," he said, his voice cracking, "and I hate myself for it." Naomi stared at him, searching his face for sincerity. For a moment, she felt a pang of pity, but it was quickly overshadowed by the memory of all the nights she had cried herself to sleep, all the mornings she had woken up to face the world alone. "Richard, I don't know if you're saying this because you mean it or because you're hoping to absolve yourself of guilt," she said firmly, "but either way, it doesn't change what happened." He nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I just want to be part of Logan's life." Naomi considered his words. "If you're serious about that, then prove it. Show up when you say you will. Treat him with the love and respect he deserves, and stay out of my way." Richard didn't argue. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll do whatever it takes." Over the next few weeks, Richard made an effort to reconnect with Logan. He visited once a week, taking him to the park or the library, and always brought him back on time. Naomi remained cautious, watching from a distance as father and son began to rebuild their bond. But Richard's attempts at reconciliation didn't extend to Naomi. She remained resolute in her decision to keep their relationship strictly co-parental. Every time he tried to initiate a deeper conversation, she shut it down. "I'm not interested in revisiting the past, Richard," she told him one afternoon. "Focus on being a good father. That's all I ask." Meanwhile, Naomi began to experience a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years. With each passing day, the house felt more like her own. She hung photos of Logan's art on the walls, set up a nursery for the baby, and filled the kitchen with the warm, inviting scents of home-cooked meals. Logan thrived in their new environment, his laughter filling the house as he played with the few toys they had. He no longer seemed weighed down by the tension that had once permeated their lives, and Naomi took comfort in knowing she had made the right decision. One evening, as Naomi sat on the couch with a cup of tea, she thought about how far she had come. There was still so much work to do, financial hurdles to overcome, a new baby to prepare for, but she no longer felt burdened by the weight of the past. She was reclaiming her life, piece by piece, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly hopeful about the future. The baby arrived on a warm spring morning, filling the air with the promise of renewal. Naomi had gone into labor in the early hours, and Leah had rushed her to the hospital while Logan stayed with a neighbor. As the contractions came faster, Naomi gripped Leah's hand, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. "You've got this," Leah said, her voice steady and reassuring. "You're the strongest person I know." Hours later, Naomi held her newborn daughter in her arms, tears streaming down her face. The baby's tiny fingers curled around hers, and in that moment, the world seemed to pause. All the pain, struggle, and heartache she had endured faded into the background. This was her second chance, her fresh start. "Welcome to the world, Maya," she whispered, smiling down at her daughter. "We've been waiting for you." The weeks after Maya's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and joyful moments. Naomi adjusted to life with two children, balancing late-night feedings with Logan's school routine and her part-time job. It wasn't easy, but it was hers, and she embraced every challenge with a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. Logan took to his role as a big brother with enthusiasm. He spent hours entertaining Maya, making silly faces and singing songs to her. Watching them together filled Naomi's heart with pride. They were a team now, a little family of three navigating the world together. Richard, to his credit, made an effort to stay involved. He visited regularly, bringing toys for Logan and clothes for Maya. He even offered to help financially, though Naomi made it clear that she didn't want his money if it came with strings attached. "I'm doing fine on my own," she told him one afternoon as he stood in the doorway with a check in hand. "If you want to contribute, do it for the kids, not for me." Richard nodded, slipping the check back into his pocket. "I get it," he said. "You've built something good here, Naomi. I won't get in the way." Naomi's career also began to flourish. Her dedication and hard work at the law firm didn't go unnoticed, and Mr. Patel offered her a promotion to full-time paralegal. The increased hours came with a higher salary and more responsibility, but Naomi welcomed the challenge. It felt like a step closer to the life she had once dreamed of. One evening, as she worked on a case at the kitchen table, Logan sat beside her with his homework and Maya gurgled happily in her playpen. The house was alive with the sounds of their little family, and Naomi felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. One day, Naomi decided it was time to officially close the chapter on her past. She met with her lawyer, Clara, to finalize the divorce. The process was smoother than she had anticipated. Richard didn't contest, and the custody agreement they had established informally became legally binding. As Naomi signed the final papers, Clara smiled. "You've come a long way, Naomi. This isn't just the end of something, it's the beginning of something better." Naomi nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Thank you, Clara, for everything." The day the divorce was finalized, Naomi treated herself and the kids to a small celebration. They went to a park, picnicking under a shady tree while Logan played tag with other children. Maya cooed in Naomi's lap, her tiny hand clutching at a blade of grass. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Logan ran over, breathless and smiling. "Mommy, can we do this every week?" Naomi laughed, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "Maybe not every week, but we'll make time for things like this, I promise." For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could make promises she could keep. Months passed, and their lives settled into a rhythm. Naomi found joy in the little things, watching Logan read to Maya, cooking dinner in their cozy kitchen, and seeing her career progress. She began to rebuild relationships with friends and even made new ones through the local community center, where she volunteered on weekends. One afternoon, as she stood in the living room, watching Logan and Maya nap on the couch, Naomi allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about the woman she had been when she married Richard, young, hopeful, and full of dreams. That woman had been broken down, but never defeated. She had found the strength to rise again, not just for herself, but for her children. Naomi's journey wasn't without its challenges, but she had learned to face them head-on. She had created a life filled with love, stability, and hope, a life that was hers alone to shape. As she looked out the window at the world beyond, she smiled, her heart brimming with gratitude. This was her new chapter, and she was ready to write the rest of her story. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Share this video with someone who might enjoy it, and check out our other videos to discover more inspiring content. See you next time.